only on C-SPAN 3. 50 years ago, on June 5, 1968, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles after winning the California presidential primary. Next on Real America, Robert F. Kennedy, 1925 to 1968. A 50-minute CBS News special report from the evening of June 6th after the senator died of his gunshot wounds. The report covers the life and assassination of the New York Democrat and is anchored by Walter Cronkite.
This is a CBS News special report. Here is CBS News correspondent Harry Reasoner.
Good evening. The body of Senator Robert Kennedy is now in the air in a jet furnished by the White House and the Air Force, heading for New York from Los Angeles. It left there a little bit before 4:30 New York time this afternoon. It will land at LaGuardia Airport in New York. The body will be brought to St. Patrick's Cathedral, arriving sometime around 9:30 New York time tonight. Tomorrow from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., and longer if there are lines there, it will lie in state before a requiem mass at 10 a.m. Saturday, then to go by train from New York to Washington, and in a motor procession from New York's Union Station to go by the Senate Office Building and by the Justice Department, where Robert Kennedy served as Attorney General, before burial at about 5:30 Saturday afternoon in the same plot where President John Kennedy lies. Already there are people gathering by St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, waiting for the arrival of the casket tonight. There is CBS News correspondent Charles Kuralt.
St. Patrick's has been the scene of the funeral of a great many public figures. And on Saturday, it's to be the scene of the high requiem mass for Senator Kennedy. The motor procession that is to bring the body of Senator Kennedy here isn't expected for another 2 hours. But already there must be 1,000 or 2,000 people gathered on Fifth Avenue in front of stores which have the picture of Senator Kennedy in them. His body will arrive here in about 2 hours and will be met by Terrence Cook, the new Archbishop of New York. And then tomorrow, all these people who are waiting here to pay their last respects to Senator Kennedy in the state from which he was elected to the Senate will have a chance to view his body. The body of the senator will lie in state at St. Patrick's all day tomorrow before the high requiem mass on Saturday morning. Charles Kuralt, CBS News, at St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, New York.
We will be there when the plane lands at LaGuardia and proceeds into St. Patrick's Cathedral tonight. In the meantime, we would like at this time to present a report on the life and career of Senator Robert Kennedy with CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite.
These last few weeks, Robert Francis Kennedy was enjoying himself. There was a good fight to fight, and he was a fighter. Ideals were at stake, and he was an idealist. And for a man whose demeanor always seemed to suggest a boyish kind of shyness, he really enjoyed getting out among the people. He enjoyed the physical contact. He refused police protection because he said that all the people wanted to do was to touch him, not to hurt him. He made a point of that. He knew that the people didn't want to hurt him. And he plunged into areas that even local mayors steer clear of, and he was manhandled. Something seemed to grow in the shy third brother of a dynamic family in these weeks of primary campaigning. The younger brother who had stayed behind the scenes and come into his own, especially in the wild final week in California.
Tuesday night was a particularly joyous night. Robert Francis Kennedy was 42 years old and had just won the victory of his political life in the California presidential primary. He spoke to his supporters, heard their cheers, and invited them to Chicago. Senator Kennedy was a very happy man as he made his way out of the crowd into the hotel kitchen, into the range of a young, swarthy assailant. The senator was hit by 2 bullets. 5 other persons were also wounded as bullets sprayed the kitchen. Only the senator was critically hurt. Police later identified the alleged assailant as 24-year-old Siran Siran, a native Jordanian who came to this country 11 years ago. Siran's brother Adel is said to have given the name to police. Fingerprints later confirmed that identification. Among the things discovered in a search of Siran's personal effects was a newspaper clipping criticizing Senator Kennedy's support of United States aid to Israel, and a notebook with scribbled lines saying Kennedy must be killed before June 5th. The suspect himself reportedly has refused to talk with police. He would not even tell them his name. Robert Kennedy was shot at 12:15 a.m. Pacific Coast Time. The end of a brilliant political and public career. At the age of 42, Robert Francis Kennedy was dead.
Robert Francis Kennedy, born November 20th, 1925, stands behind his father, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, in this 1934 family portrait. He was 8 years old, the third of 4 sons in a family of 9 children. The eldest son, Joseph Jr., was killed in World War II. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, assassinated in 1963, 3 years after becoming President of the United States, sits behind his mother, the former Rose Fitzgerald. Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy hold the 4th son, Edward, now Senator from Massachusetts. Joseph P. Kennedy went to London in 1937 as U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain. Robert, then 11, is on the far right. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought most of the ambassador's family back home. Robert poses aboard the SS Washington in New York Harbor with his mother and 2 of his sisters, Eunice, far left, and Kathleen. Kathleen was killed in an air crash in 1948. During vacations from Massachusetts Milton Academy in the early 1940s, Robert relaxed with the family at their winter home in Palm Beach, Florida. He strolls here with sisters Eunice at left and Jean. He entered Harvard in 1943, but left shortly after to join the Navy, where on his request he served aboard the newly commissioned destroyer, named for his brother Joe, killed in action the year before. Back at Harvard in 1946, Robert posed on the steps of the varsity club with 3 fellow members of the football team. He played end that year, and after graduating in 1948, he entered law school at the University of Virginia. His marriage came in 1950 in a ceremony at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. Ethel Skakel, shown here at left, became Mrs. Robert F. Kennedy. Eunice Kennedy, who was to marry Sergeant Shriver, is at right. Robert received his law degree in 1951 and became widely known in the years immediately following. First as a counsel for Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigating subcommittee in the Senate. Later, under Senator McClellan, as chief counsel for the subcommittee. He and Ethel began raising a family during those years. One of the most controversial episodes in Kennedy's career, a subject often brought up by political opponents over the years, was his service as assistant counsel to the McCarthy Committee. This was 1953, when McCarthy, after rocking the nation with charges of communism in high places, became embroiled in a battle with Army officials represented by Attorney Joseph Welch. The stormy hearings, which arose from McCarthy's claims of subversion at an Army camp, led to the eclipse of Senator McCarthy's career, and to the resignation of Robert Kennedy from the committee after 6 months' service. Kennedy had been feuding with McCarthy's chief counsel, Roy Cohn. But Kennedy was to return to the committee as counsel for the Democrats, and ultimately he succeeded Cohn as chief counsel and staff director. In 1957, Kennedy stepped into a role that was to heighten his reputation as a tough investigator, chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee. He began an investigation into the Teamsters Union and found a major adversary, Teamsters President James Hoffman. Their exchanges were abrasive.
What action did you take to find out whether these locals had members, whether these locals were gangster run, whether there were racketeers in charge of them? What did you do then, Mr. Hoffa?
Mr. Kennedy, it was not my responsibility in the New York area to do anything, and the General President was enjoined by Martin Lacey.
Hoffa charged that Kennedy was conducting a vendetta against him and used the word ruthless to describe him, a word that many other critics later used, that Kennedy himself came to joke about. Kennedy was often described as a kind of lightning rod during the successful 1960 presidential campaign of his brother, John F. Kennedy. It was Robert, their associates said, who handled the tough jobs and took the criticism, leaving his brother free to accept the adulation of the crowds. By all accounts, Robert Kennedy ran a brilliant and tireless campaign that year, working behind the scenes to persuade the politicians to support his brother, while John Kennedy went to the people. One political associate said recently that the one major drawback in Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign was that he did not have anyone to do the kind of job he used to do for his brother. Over Robert Kennedy's objections, but at the insistence of both his brother, the president, and his father, Robert Kennedy was named Attorney General in his brother's cabinet. Joe Kennedy commented, "Nepotism my foot. Why would anyone think that Bobby needs a job?" President Kennedy said with humor, "I can't see that it's wrong to give him a little legal experience before he goes out to practice law." Attorney General Kennedy was a member of the National Security Council and a trusted advisor to his brother. Some say it was he who came up with the diplomatic ploy that solved the Cuban Missile Crisis. The two brothers stood together during the dark days of integration battles at the universities of Mississippi and Alabama. President Kennedy confided in his younger brother. Others admired him, but he made enemies during those days, in the South, in the unions, and in big business during the 1962 steel price dispute. Robert Kennedy toured the world in February 1962 as the second most important man in the American government. He met an independent President Sukarno who wanted to take New Guinea from the Dutch by force. Kennedy's message, the issue must be settled not by force, but by negotiation. Ethel Kennedy's appearance, a strategic one, came later. The Kennedys visited the ancient, normally quiet shrine of Nara in Japan, but quiet gave way to the aura of American and Kennedy fame. The Kennedy guides, then ambassador, and Mrs. Edwin Reischauer. Mrs. Reischauer is Japanese. At Japanese schools and factories, Kennedy was mobbed like a teenager's idol. He told his hosts he wanted a minimum of ceremony, a lot of face-to-face meetings with the people. The result was reminiscent of his brother's 1960 campaign. The Kennedy visit to Waseda University brought him together with a vast mob of students, many of them hostile leftists. But in a give-and-take session in the auditorium, he would acquit himself well. There were some bruising encounters with Japanese businessmen after a breakfast of clam soup, dried seaweed, crab meat, and chicken with bamboo shoots. The Japanese protested our high tariffs. Kennedy talked about American worries over competition from cheap foreign labor and our own unemployment problems. From Tokyo, the Kennedys went on to Hong Kong, where he saw the thousands of refugees, primarily from Red China, in the city's many congested apartment buildings. Kennedy also took to the streets and was mobbed by hundreds of young Chinese. The Kennedy visit to Vietnam was a visit to Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Airport. They left the plane briefly during an hour-and-a-half stopover. At the time, of course, in 1962, there were far fewer Americans there than there are now. On the lush island of Bali, the Kennedys wore the traditional flower leis and were showered by flower petals. It was one of their romantic stops, a bit of relaxation from visits where world problems were more keenly felt. And it was a stop Robert and Ethel Kennedy could take in style as well as in stride. On his arrival in West Berlin, Kennedy was met by Mayor Willy Brandt, and together they reviewed a guard of honor. He called the Berlin Wall shocking and shameful, and before he left the city, he recorded a message for broadcast to East Berlin, citing the difficulties under which the residents lived. In Rome, the Kennedys were granted a private audience with Pope John XXIII. It was one of many visits members of the Kennedy family have made to the Vatican. President Kennedy, in his visit a year later, met with Pope John's successor, Pope Paul.
Those were the 1,000 days of the Kennedy administration, the spirit of what was called Camelot, of a young president who had pledged to get the country moving again. But it all ended that terrible November day in Dallas. CBS News correspondents pick up the story as the body of President Kennedy was returned to Washington.
This is the scene at Andrews Air Force Base where the casket of carrying the body of President Kennedy is being transferred to an ambulance. Behind it come Mrs. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy.
And now comes the family. The Attorney General, Mrs. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy. Behind them, other members of the family. Then President Johnson. Apparently another change in plans.
In 1964, Kennedy won the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senator from New York.
I accept your nomination gratefully.
During the campaign, Kennedy's critics called him an interloper, running for office in New York, although he lived in Virginia and voted in Massachusetts. But Kennedy insisted that the basic question was, who was best suited to represent the state of New York? And he found many who were pleased that he had changed his locale.
President Kennedy said that we have the capacity to make this the best generation in the history of mankind or make it the last. I think we can make it the best generation in the history of mankind. I think all of us joined together can make that difference. Can't we just walk a few blocks and go down and register? Is that asking too much? You want to sing the song? All right, we sing a song. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Buenos dias, amigos. Very good. They said that was very good. My accent is very good, everybody. I think that the effort that we're making against poverty, I think the war on poverty can have an effect here. Many of the parts of the war on poverty came out of the Department of Justice, and the efforts that we make to have people live decent lives, I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of expanding it. I don't say that being elected to the United States Senate is going to make these problems disappear, but I think that we can continue the same effort that was made in 1961. Viva Johnson! Viva Hubert Humphrey! Viva Frank Rossetti! Viva Robert Kennedy!
Robert Francis Kennedy was like a prism. The color he gave off depended on how you held him to the light. He gave everyone a choice. There was a Robert Kennedy to love and a Robert Kennedy to hate, a Robert Kennedy to trust, a Robert Kennedy to suspect. His idolaters were matched in the intensity of their affection for him only by the fury of those he angered. It is easier to say who is not a great man than who is, and we all bestow greatness quicker on our artists than on our politicians. History will find its own place for Robert Kennedy. He was, in a time when physical comfort is so often the object of desire, a hard-driving, apparently fearless adventurer whose relentless energy took him to the tops of mountains, through dangerous rock-mined rapids, down snow-covered slopes, on excursions into the African bush. He seemed driven by an urge to risk his life on frequent occasions. He was, among overblown politicians, a cool political realist whose relentless aggressiveness was relieved by a sometimes irrepressible sense of humor, which he employed at his own expense.
I asked my wife as I was coming down whether she could think of a joke. She said, if they look at the top of your head, they'll laugh.
At a time when the young were confused and rebellious, he was a political apostle who offered some hope that there was worldly pleasure to be taken from noble actions.
Give me a place that I can stand and I can move the world, said Archimedes. We might look back and say, but it's futile. What difference can one individual make? How can he change the world? What role can he play? But if we look back upon the history of this country and the history of the world, we know the difference that an individual can make.
His was the face that launched 1,000 successful magazine sales, and the publishing houses almost daily, it seemed, put forth books with that saleable face on the cover. There was never a let-up in the Bobby Kennedy phenomenon. It came and it went, but it ebbed more than it flowed. Just when it seemed to be subsiding, he made another speech critical of U.S. policy in Vietnam, wrote a sharply worded letter to another Democrat, made an impolitic remark at a press conference, or took a kayak trip up a creek, and the whole nation was caught up again with his very specialness. There was always the assumption of his great popularity, both by his friends and his enemies. They assumed he would someday reach the White House, yet no politician in modern times engendered such extremes of devotion and distrust. It was in all probability because of an unusual set of factors, some peculiar to American life, some peculiar to Kennedy's life. They pulled against each other, working to his advantage and his disadvantage. There was his public identification with his brother, John F. Kennedy, in the golden years of the new frontier. He was associated with the glamour of the early 60s when the White House had youth, style, and a French chef, and government looked like fun. He seemed capable of endowing his followers, many of whom embarrassed him by running ahead, with a zest for the notion that a single person can make this a better world.
We can't find answers to them completely, but at least we'll face them and at least we'll make progress with them.
His appeal was most obvious for the country's youth, particularly its college students. He told them they were important, that they must participate even though their elders in government, industry, and education did not trust them. He trusted them.
You have a much greater stake than any of the rest of us, because you've got the least ties to the past and really to the present and the greatest stake in the future, much more than any of those that are presently within government. So what we do and the decisions that we make obviously have greatest effect on all of you. To make your voices heard and to work for policies and programs that you're interested in, not just to leave this school and turn your back on all of these matters, I think is essential. As I say, I don't have any easy way in which it's all going to be accomplished, but I would tell you that it can make a difference.
Robert Kennedy joked about lowering the voting age to 12. I lose them after 25, he said. But Kennedy's identification with the young was also a personal one because he was young. He looked young, and he acted as if he always would be young. Many of those who worshiped John Kennedy came to worship Robert. Robert was a strange hero. Most American heroes have given up something important to attain their goal: money, pleasure, pride, or power. He seemed to have renounced none of these. Robert and Ethel Kennedy's family of 10 were based most of the year at the 10-acre Hickory Hill estate. It is what Ethel calls Bobby's backyard. He was a selfless father who took a lively and sympathetic interest in each child, whether it was the baby's first attempt at swimming or the eldest son's choice of a school. Kathleen, Joe, Bobby, David, Courtney, Michael, Carrie, Christopher, Matthew, Douglas. And neither was he too busy to know their friends, Brumus, Panda, and Freckles, and Battlestar, the dogs, and the horses, and the iguanas, and the rabbits, and the turtles, and the geese. There will be another child he will never know. Kennedy's wealth, estimated at $10 million, his energy and his eternal youth provided him with great mobility. It was hard to tell where he would turn up next. They had, for example, one gay time on the upper reaches of New York's Hudson River, with 7 of their 10 children and a station wagon full of nieces and nephews, including Carolyn Kennedy. The senator and his wife led an expedition of rubber rafts, canoes, and kayaks into midstream and had a ball. And when they skied at Sun Valley, the hills were covered with happy Kennedys. Bobby would take any hill. His form was described by a ski instructor as not very graceful, but damned aggressive. It must have seemed to many that Kennedy's life was a merry-go-round of glamorous people, births, balls, and a life where no moment was left unfilled. But these were the events that filled the cracks in his life. For the most part, his life was made of work, only less hard perhaps because he loved work, as he loved play. It is some small consolation to know that he lived more life in 42 years than most would live in 80. The Kennedy critics saw much of this as money too obviously enjoyed, millions expended for fun, political power, and public image. But Robert Kennedy's life was not a series of theatrical happenings. He had staked out new ground on basic public policies, and in recent months he had spoken out often on the 3 most inflammatory issues in American life: Vietnam, civil rights, poverty. Each time he took what was, at the time he took it, a minority position.
Say the Negro has made great progress, which is true, and that he should be satisfied and be patient, which is neither true nor realistic. And if any man claims the Negro should be content or satisfied, let him say he would willingly change the color of his skin and go to live in the Negro section of any of our major cities. I happen to have some differences of some importance with the administration in connection with Vietnam. But I don't think that the answer or solution to Vietnam is to question the patriotism of those that we disagree with. And I don't think that we've been putting enough of our resources into the fight against poverty over the period of the last few years. Now, undoubtedly, the reason is because of the cost of the war in Vietnam. But we spent last year in the poverty war against poverty, on the OEO, we spent about the equivalent of about 2.5 weeks of the war in Vietnam, and I think we can do better than that.
The word ruthless was probably first applied to the senator 10 years ago when he was the combative chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee. His style seemed tough to tough old-line Democrats. It seemed too self-confident, too sophisticated. He pursued the demons of segregation, racketeering, and price rigging in a manner many thought too zealous. In listening to people talk about Robert Kennedy, it was sometimes hard to believe they were talking about the same man.
He's much too abrasive. He's much too rude. He's terribly concerned about the people around him. He's terribly concerned about people in general.
He's been built up with this almost idolatry around him, and I guess he just feels that that everybody should defer to what he wants and to accept his judgment on all problems.
I think it stems mostly from the fact that he's had the courage of his convictions and the courage to do what he thinks was right and to take it head on. And so people that don't like what he's done have said, well, he's ruthless.
I would describe Bob as dedicated and loyal. I would qualify that by saying that Bob believes so strongly in the ends he is pursuing that he is not over-scrupulous about the means that he employs.
Oh, he's a strong individual in the sense of character and determination. But I don't think he's ruthless, if that's what you mean. He's determined and persistent.
Ethel Kennedy was asked if it ever hurt.
I suppose on some rare occasions, when somebody says something about him that's not very pleasant to hear.
He talked to CBS News correspondent Roger Mudd.
I do, aren't I being nice to you?
Very nice, but...
See?
But most people still have the view that...
Most?
Well, I suppose that's unfair. But
yes.
In the public prints, people are not surprised by... They think there is always an ulterior motive in what you do. Is that...
Is that what?
Is that accurate?
No.
No.
What did you think I was going to say?
Is this something now that's gotten started and you can't do anything to stop it? The public image that you have?
I don't know.
Oh, how did it get started?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
The McCarthy thing and the Hoffa thing and the 60 campaign?
I suppose I've been in positions which... But I don't know exactly. I don't know.
But Robert Kennedy had many constant reminders of his great popularity, his importance, and the significance of his life. He received an average of 50 speaking invitations a day, 6 days a week. It was not unusual for him to receive 2,500 letters in a single day. Robert Kennedy used every minute of his day. He walked from his office to the Capitol in all weather, not for exercise or recreation. It was 5 minutes away from 2,500 letters a day for a briefing by a knowledgeable aide. Hearings occupied much of Robert Kennedy's time, but they did not satisfy his full range of interest or curiosity about the subject.
Do you know anything about the poverty program?
No.
You ever heard of Head Start?
No.
Nice to see you.
Kennedy worked hard for his new state, New York, and he earned the grudging respects of many of his colleagues who had opposed him in 1964. In his first year in the Senate, he compiled a remarkable record for a senior senator, and he was only a freshman. No matter what he accomplished, it was too little to satisfy his soaring ambitions to do and to move and to make things go. He was asked whether the Senate was a satisfying place to be.
I think it's at times frustrating, the fact that you can't get more done, and you find there are matters that really require immediate attention, emergency matters, and that you feel strongly that the country or an area of the country would be better off, or a group of people or part of our society would have better lives if we took a particular course of action, and to see it go on day after day, and that's frustrating. If you're in the executive branch of the government, or a governor, I expect, or the executive branch of the government here in Washington, it's much more possible to take an action and see some results from it immediately. That's not possible in the United States Senate, so I think that part of it is frustrating.
Just watching the Senate in action, it's occurred to me that senators have one characteristic in common, and that's vanity. Is that an accurate observation?
Well, somebody once said about the fact, you know, in the Senate presiding officer, it's called the president. When somebody says, Mr. President, 100 pairs of eyes look up. I don't know. I suppose that everybody in politics, and you're up in front of crowds, and then to some extent, you begin to think that what you say is important and significant. And And because people clap at the beginning, when you stand up, people clap at the beginning, they clap at the end.
Do you think about running for president?
Well, I don't mean, I'm not being morbid about it.
Yeah.
Making any plans to run, or making a decision that I will run, or knowing that at some future time in the history of the United States I'm going to run for president, I don't. I mean, quite frankly, I don't. Just because I don't think that you can plan for the future at all.
On March 16th, Senator Kennedy had made up his mind to make the race for president.
I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who are now making them. I cannot stand aside from the contest that will decide our nation's future and our children's future. The remarkable New Hampshire campaign of Senator Eugene McCarthy has proven how deep are the present divisions within our party and within our country. Until that was publicly clear, my presence in the race would have been seen as a clash of personalities rather than issues. But now that that fight is won, and over policies which I have long been challenging, I must enter that race. The fight is just beginning, and I believe that I can win. I do not lightly dismiss the dangers and the difficulties of challenging an incumbent president. But these are not ordinary times, and this is not an ordinary election. At stake is not simply the leadership of our party and even our country. It is our right to the moral leadership of this planet.
It was just 4 days after Senator McCarthy's stunning performance in New Hampshire that Senator Kennedy set out to capture the Democratic nomination. He was criticized by those who said he should have gone into New Hampshire himself, and by those who said he should not have stolen the spotlight so abruptly from McCarthy. But Kennedy said the crucial issues of war and poverty dividing the country made it essential for him to run, and he said the people would understand his message. Although Kennedy was privately a rather shy and reserved man, he relished the almost bruising contact with the crowds that swelled and roared around him as they had for his brother. Occasionally, in all the public affection, he lost the tie clip, a handkerchief, even a shoe, anything his admirers could get their hands on. But he smiled through it all, and some said he needed physical proof of his popularity, tangible evidence that he was the candidate of the people. This was a campaign in which he seemed more relaxed and good-humored than ever before, a time in which he could laugh at himself and the persistent charges of his critics that he was too ambitious. He had to be, he said, as the seventh of 9 children, just to be able to survive. And he developed a bantering style with his audiences.
So will you give me your vote? And will you give me your hand? And are we going to win on Tuesday? And we'll win the Chicago Convention in August, and we'll win the election in November, and we'll make a difference for our citizens here in the United States of America.
If I had hair like that, I could get elected any place.
Throughout the campaign, he emphasized his concern for the poor and forgotten in a rich country. He said the ghettos must be transformed into places where human beings could live decently, that the rich must be taxed more heavily to help pay for a better society, that the great divisions of class and color must be bridged over. He portrayed himself as the candidate of peace and reconciliation, and of a youthful, questing spirit, the spirit of a new style politics. His wife Ethel was frequently with him, contributing to the image of youth and high spirits. Those close to Kennedy said it particularly disturbed him that McCarthy had won the allegiance of so many of the young. But Kennedy, too, was the favorite of many young people to whom he directed his primary messages of peace in Vietnam and the rest of the world, and justice at home. This was a campaign of early triumphs for Kennedy in Indiana and Nebraska, and then defeat in the Oregon primary, the first time a Kennedy had lost an election. But then the tide turned for him in South Dakota and California. He talked confidently about Chicago and the convention.
Tuesday night began as the high point in Kennedy's campaign. He'd won the California primary, the one he had to win to stay in the race. But the exultant victory statement turned out to be his last speech before disaster. CBS News correspondent Terry Drinkwater reports.
What I think is quite clear is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that what has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions, whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or on the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country, and a selfish country, and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next few months. So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you.
Kennedy left the platform quickly to escape the pushing, shoving, celebrating admirers. He went through a side door into a pantry next to the hotel kitchen, and there it happened. This next film begins perhaps 5 seconds after the shots were fired.
Look out for the gun. Okay. I'm doctor! I'm doctor! Oh, God, Sam! Oh, what? Shoot it! Please shoot it! Oh, no! Get it, girl! Get it, doctor! Get it, doctor! Back up! Get away! Get away!
5 others were also wounded. None is in critical condition now.
We need a doctor here. Where's the doctor? Is there a doctor?
The suspect, now identified as Sirhan Sirhan, was grabbed by Rafer Johnson and Rosie Greer, the 2 Kennedy men. Then he was led by police back through the ballroom and the hotel. Some of the officers had to protect him from the crowd. There were several Kennedy supporters, bystanders, who were close to hysteria at this point, and there was concern for the suspect's safety. In his pocket, officers found newspaper clippings attacking Kennedy. Sirhan is the man in the blue shirt, dark complexion at the far side of the squad car. Two of the others who were hit were brought back to the ballroom. By then, most people knew what had happened. 7 minutes before, this room was the place of Senator Kennedy's finest political triumph. At this moment, Kennedy was being taken on a stretcher from the hotel to an ambulance.
If there's a doctor in the house, I want to see him right here. Everybody else, please stay back.
The ambulance bearing Senator Kennedy arrived first at Central Receiving Hospital. Then, 3 of the other wounded were brought in. Doctors inside discovered for the first time the critical nature of Kennedy's wounds. They quickly decided to transfer him to Good Samaritan Hospital, where the facilities were better for delicate brain surgery.
Hold it, guys, hold it.
Mrs. Kennedy was with him all of the time, riding in the ambulance, now from one hospital to the other.
Oh, help me, help me, help me, help me. Get out.
Please stand back.
Please stand back.
Out front.
Mrs. Salinger.
There's a cable there. Back up. Mr. Uno, do you have a card?
The clergy and the statesmen from their pulpits and podia speak of the violence that racks our world. They speak of Robert Francis Kennedy, but they speak too of every man. The people weep for the Kennedys. Perhaps they should weep too for themselves. This is Walter Cronkite reporting.
We will return in 5 seconds after station identification.
This is CBS.
The plane bearing the body of Senator Kennedy has passed Pittsburgh, headed for New York. At LaGuardia Airport is CBS News correspondent Morton Dean.
The hot spring sun has just begun to disappear from the sky, and the crowds have begun to arrive here at the private aviation section of LaGuardia Airport. The long flight from Los Angeles, the 4-hour flight, will soon be over. The presidential jet, Air Force One, is expected here sometime within the hour. The Boeing 707 carries the senator's body, his wife, and 3 of the 10 Kennedy children, and some 70 friends of Robert Kennedy, many familiar names in government, the arts, show business, and sports. From Kennedy Airport, the funeral cortege, or rather from LaGuardia Airport, Kennedy Airport, named after the late senator's brother John F. Kennedy, is several miles from here and serves the metropolitan New York area. But here, from LaGuardia, the funeral cortege will travel into Manhattan, a slow ride that should take approximately 40 minutes. The body will lie in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral, the magnificent cathedral on 5th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. Security here is very extensive, uniformed and plainclothes policemen from all levels of government, from police forces on all levels of government. New York City, the state, some security agents from Washington are also here, and credentials of press people being checked very, very carefully. The crowd being restricted to an area beyond the fence. They will be, the crowd will be some, 50 to 75 yards from Air Force One when it lands here at LaGuardia. Once again, the plane is due here sometime within the hour. Morton Dean, CBS News at LaGuardia Airport.
Following the Requiem Mass on Saturday morning in New York and the train trip from New York to Washington, the body of Senator Kennedy will be taken through the streets of Washington and past buildings which played a part in his career. CBS News correspondent Bruce Morton traces the route.
This is Washington's Union Station, where the train bringing the body of Senator Robert Kennedy from New York will arrive. From here, the procession will depart for Arlington Cemetery. It will not be elaborate, it will not be military, but it will, as it travels these familiar Washington streets, echo much of Robert Kennedy's life. Just a few blocks from Union Station are the Senate office buildings. In the old office building here is the big caucus room where Robert Kennedy first gained fame as the counsel for Senator John McClellan's Labor Rackets Committee. That was the role in which he fought his fiery verbal battles with Teamster leader James Hoffa. As a senator, of course, Robert Kennedy came back to a suite of offices in the new Senate office building. He liked a breath of fresh air during a working day. And in good weather and bad, he used to enjoy the walk from the office building back and forth to the Capitol, even though he was often stopped, besieged by tourists wanting a picture or an autograph. The procession, the motorcade, Pierre Salinger called it, will swing next down Pennsylvania Avenue, past the rows of government office buildings, past the Justice Department, where Robert Kennedy, during his brother's administration, served as Attorney General. Years of controversy, years of landmark decisions in the field of civil rights. The avenue swings up past the Treasury Department, almost the reverse of the route taken during a presidential inaugural. Past the White House, where Senator Kennedy, then Attorney General, remembered the late nights during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The White House, which he had hoped this year to claim in his own right. Then the motorcade will head south, past the Lincoln Memorial, past Resurrection City, home of the poor people who in an almost personal way were the special constituency of this man so driven by compassion for the poor, the disadvantaged of the country. And so across Memorial Bridge to Arlington National Cemetery. Robert Kennedy's life since 1963 has echoed to that earlier tragedy in Dallas. Those echoes, that sense of history reenacted, grew with Senator Kennedy's decision to seek the presidency, grew during the campaign as a voice with a familiar accent, a familiar cadence, stirred crowds to memory and to new enthusiasm. So it is fitting that the journey should end here at the grave of the late president, where the terrible echo sounds the loudest, where past and present violence will meet. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Arlington National Cemetery.
This is Dan Rather at the White House. President Johnson, just a short while ago, signed into law the new bill officially authorizing Secret Service protection for all presidential candidates and their families. Congress this afternoon also agreed, finally, on federal gun control legislation. But the bill primarily deals with handguns. It isn't nearly as strong as what President Johnson has been suggesting. However, before the shooting of Senator Robert Kennedy, Mr. Johnson might have accepted the bill as possibly the best he could get this year. Now he thinks he and the country can do better. This afternoon, he read a letter to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, urging, demanding might be the better description, much more sweeping gun control legislation.
Today I sent the following statement to the Speaker of the House and to the Vice President, the President of the Senate. Today the nation cries out to the conscience of the Congress. Criminal violence from the muzzle of a gun has once again brought heartbreak to America. Surely this must be clear beyond question. The hour has come for the Congress to enact a strong and effective gun control law governing the full range of lethal weapons. I have sought and I have fought for such a law through all the days of my presidency. On many occasions before, I have spoken of the terrible toll inflicted on our people by firearms. 750,000 Americans dead since the turn of the century. This is far more than have died at the hands of all of our enemies in all of the wars that we have fought. Sorrow and suffering that just cannot be counted, and fear that can never be measured. Each year in this country, guns are involved in more than 6,500 murders. This compares with 30 in England, 99 in Canada, 68 in West Germany, and 37 in Japan. 44,000 aggravated assaults are committed with guns in America each year. 50,000 robberies are committed with guns in America each year. I have told the Congress and I have told the nation of the brutal loopholes in our nation's laws. 2 million guns were sold in the United States last year. Far too many of those guns were bought by the demented and the deranged, the hardened criminal and the convict, the addict and the alcoholic. And we cannot expect these irresponsible people to be prudent in their protection of us. But we can, and we have a right to expect, the Congress of the United States to protect us from them. Weapons of destruction can be purchased by mail as easily as baskets of fruit or cartons of cigarettes. We must eliminate the dangers of mail order murder in this country. The Congress has finally begun to take some action. The Senate has passed a watered-down version of the gun control law. I sent to the Congress some time ago with my recommendations. The House has taken action on the Senate bill. But this halfway measure is not near enough. It covers adequately only transactions involving handguns. It leaves the deadly commerce in lethal shotguns and rifles without effective control 55 long months after the mail-order murder of President John F. Kennedy. So today, I call upon the Congress in the name of sanity. I call upon the Congress in the name of safety and in the name of an aroused citizenship to give America the gun control law that American citizens need. I urge the Congress to make it unlawful to sell rifles and shotguns, as well as handguns, by mail order. I urge the Congress to make it unlawful to sell rifles and shotguns, as well as handguns, to persons who are too young to bear the terrible responsibility that's placed in the hands of a gun owner. I urge the Congress and plead with it to make it unlawful to sell rifles and shotguns as well as handguns in one state to the residents of another state. This will not prevent legitimate hunters or sportsmen from purchasing firearms, but with this reinforced law, we can then give the states the proper incentive to shape their own gun control legislation. And the country can, at long last, have a network of systematic safeguards for all of our citizens. And today I am asking each of the governors of the 50 states to immediately and to comprehensively review their gun laws and to amend them where necessary and rewrite them in order to fully protect the citizens of the states that they serve, protect them from the deadly weapons that are now in dangerous hands. The voices of the few must no longer prevail over the interests of the many. When I last appealed to the Congress on this subject again, and that was only a month ago, I asked this question: what in the name of conscience will it take to pass a truly effective gun control law in the Congress? And now, in this new hour of tragedy, that question should at last be answered. So let us now spell out our grief in constructive action.
Part of what the President has in mind is a minimum age of 18 for the purchase of rifles and shotguns. 21 already is the suggested age by Congress for the purchase of handguns. White House aide Joe Califano says that he has never seen Mr. Johnson more disturbed than the President has been over the failure of Congress to enact stronger gun control legislation. Mr. Johnson now is plainly hoping that public pressure, renewed pressure in the wake of Senator Robert Kennedy's death, will prod Congress to come up with a stronger bill. Dan Rather, CBS News, the White House.